Anne Hamilton-Byrne was born Evelyn Grace Victoria Edwards on December 30th, 1921 in Sale, Australia, and is a co-founder of a 1960s cult called the Great White Brotherhood, or also known as the Family. Her mother was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and would die in an insane asylum where she had spent half of her life. Anne would later tell her followers that her mother could talk to the spirits of dead people, and she wrote their stories, and that's why she was classed as mentally ill. Her father was unable to keep a job and was unable to raise her, and subsequently she spent her childhood in and out of orphanages until she was old enough to leave and changed her name. She gave birth to one child from her first marriage and lost her husband Don in a car accident. Their daughter's name was Judith. However, their daughter would later change her name to Natasha. Anne started to take yoga classes where she would become interested in Eastern religion. Anne began to believe that her husband's loss was a punishment for being too close to him, too in love with him. She was convinced that her version of a god had taken her husband away from her to teach her not to become too attached to anyone to avoid getting hurt. In early 1961, while working as a yoga instructor, Anne and her partner Bill met Rainer Johnson. This would be the catalyst for the formation of the cult. He was a highly respected philosopher and researcher with a PhD in physics. He owned property in Santaniketan in the eastern outskirts of Melbourne and was hosting regular group meetings led by Anne, discussing religious and philosophical matters. Bill was a wealthy man from England who moved to Victoria with his wife and 4 children. There he met Anne and fell for her almost immediately. His wife May was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Kew that was used for Anne's purposes and will be mentioned later in this video. His 4 children would eventually become estranged as he demanded their loyalty to Anne and her beliefs once he married her in 1977. A few days before Christmas in 1962, Anne rang Rainer Johnson's doorbell. Dr. Johnson and his wife were going to be making a trip to India, and she told him that they should be cautious as his wife Mary would fall ill. While in India, Mary became very sick with dysentery, and the couple had to return to their home in Melbourne. In 1963, Dr. Johnson contacted Anne, and him and his wife were the first members of the family. The following year, in 1964, Anne's only daughter Judith, who was 19 at the time, was involved in a car accident. She sustained a fracture at the base of her skull, which could have easily killed her. The surgeon also reported that she had sustained deep lacerations to her face. Anne would quickly gather people to pray and provide spiritual help, and within 2 days, Judith was sitting up and her vital signs were all within normal limits. To everyone's surprise, a week later, Judith would leave the hospital and Dr. Johnson and his wife would take her home. Dr. Johnson would later write in a diary what he had told his wife. "I think this is the most Christ-like person I have ever met." Later that same year, Dr. Johnson and his wife Mary would purchase some adjoining property at Miss Hamilton-Byrne's request, which they would later name Santaniketan Park, and he would be asked to retire from Melbourne University. In 1968, a meeting hall was built on that property, and that was named the Santaniketan Lodge. Anne began to believe she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ and convinced Dr. Johnson he was John the Baptist, and she needed to create a master race. She was charismatic and a very good manipulator. Her followers included respected middle-class professionals, including teachers, doctors, nurses, and lawyers who were willing to do whatever they were asked to do by their master, Anne. Dr. Johnson recruited many members by referring them to Anne's yoga classes. Many of its members lived in the suburbs nearby and would meet each Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday evening at the Santaniketan Lodge. In the late 1960s and 70s, a cult member who owned and managed a psychiatric hospital in Kew began treating its patients with LSD. I should also mention that many of the hospital staff were members of the cult. The hospital was used to recruit possible new members who were patients and to administer LSD to its existing members as they had to take the drug regularly. The prolonged use of this drug had physical and mental destructive effects. They suffered depression, personality disorders, night terrors, and social withdrawal. One of the original members was given LSD, electroconvulsive therapy, and 2 lobotomies. Anne brainwashed members into handing over their babies to her so she could raise them as her own to be a part of the master race that would save the world. Between 1968 and 1975, Anne and Bill had adopted 14 infants and children through illegal adoption completed by doctors, lawyers, and social workers who were part of the family and could easily complete the process without having to jump through hoops. The children's last names were changed to Hamilton-Byrne either by falsifying birth records or using a deed poll. The children's hair was dyed blonde, and she dressed them alike in an attempt to make them look like they were all siblings and Anne was their mother. She convinced teenage mothers to hand over their babies to her and married men to leave their wives and procreate with other women to create more children for Anne. Anne claimed she had given birth to these children despite being in her 50s and continued to make these claims even after she had had a hysterectomy. She wore pregnancy smocks and convinced cult members she was pregnant for years. Her grand total of adopted children was 28. She kept them at Kai Lama, a 5-acre property on the shores of Lake Eildon, a popular vacation spot in Victoria, Australia. Unbeknownst to the vacationers below, the children could watch the people on the lake having fun while they were imprisoned behind a barbed wire fence. The children could not cross the barbed wire fence to access the outside world. They were disciplined at the slightest infraction with severe beatings, waterboarding, starvation, freezing showers, and holding their fingers over open flames. The children were also subjected to the regular LSD intake once they turned 14, but had to go through an initiation phase which involved the intake of the drug and were left alone in a dark room. Before they turned 14, they were dosed with diazepam, Haldol, Thorazine, and benzodiazepines among a plethora of other psychotic drugs in order to keep them obedient. They were also told that Anne was their mother and the men and women on their property were their aunties and uncles. Sarah Hamilton-Byrne was one of these children and would be instrumental in bringing attention to the family. She was expelled from the cult in 1987 due to her rebellious and argumentative behavior. She would provide information on the abuse that was going on at Kai Lama, and a raid of the property took place on August 14, 1987. They removed 7 children from the property who were going to be initiated with LSD upon Anne's return to Australia. After Anne learned about the raid, her and her husband Bill would stay out of Australia for 6 years. Operation Force was created with police from Australia, the US, and the UK to capture Anne and Bill. In June of 1993, they would be arrested in Hurleyville, New York, in the Catskill Mountains and extradited to Australia. They were charged with conspiracy to defraud and commit perjury by falsifying birth records of 3 unrelated children her and Bill claimed were their triplets, one of which was Sarah Hamilton-Byrne. The conspiracy to defraud charge would be dropped. Anne and Bill would plead guilty to committing perjury by falsifying birth records and were fined $5,000 each, but served no jail time. Bill died in 2001, and Sarah visited him before he passed. Anne Hamilton-Byrne would be diagnosed with dementia and would live the rest of her years in a nursing home, caring for a baby doll until her death on June 13, 2019. She outlived some of the children, members of the cult, and her husband. Many of the children have suffered psychological problems. A few of them have either tried or sadly have succeeded in ending their own life. Sarah herself attempted suicide and lost her left leg. She wore a prosthetic and used forearm crutches to get around. Sarah would pass away at the age of 46 in May of 2016. Well, that's it for this week's video. If you enjoyed it, drop it a like and subscribe. See you next week.